Hello and welcome to yet another lecture. In the last lecture we did the unwrapping, we also made a texture and we named that texture, but the texture is not yet connected to the model. That means that the model doesn't have or even can't have any color yet, because we need to connect the texture to the model in some way. And the way it works is that the texture will be connected to the model and the UV map helps to tell the model which part of the texture, so the color, needs to go on which place on the model. So for example, this square here is the same square as the square on the top of the base of the well. So anything painted here on this texture will also be painted on the top of the base of the well. And vice versa, when we later on have this connected, when we paint something on the top of the base of the well, it will also be painted on the textures on the same place. So you can work either on the model in 3D or on the texture itself in 2D. Can you still follow me? It's pretty complex if you've never done this before, so don't worry if you don't get it right away. It will get more clear later on when you connect things together and you start painting on the model. So let's continue. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add a material to the well. We'll go to a different layout for that. We are in UV editing now. UV editing. And we'll go to the shading layout. That's the one over here. So click on that. So we have different editors here. This one looks like the one we've seen before, but in this case it's the image editor, not the UV editor. This is the 3D viewport. This is the shader editor. You can see that here, shader editor. And here we have the properties with all the tabs. And above here we have the outliner. And last but not least, before I forget, here's the file browser. The 3D viewport is now in a different shading mode. When you look here, you see there are 4 shading options, and one we see now is Look Dev. And Look Dev is sort of a preview of the final render. Some tricks are used to make it faster than the render shading, so the 3D viewport is a little bit faster so you can work easier with shaders, for example. The viewport shading is the one you've seen before. It's the same as you use with the box modeling, for example, in the default layout. So you have the model, you see a camera and a lamp. And what's missing is the floor and the grid that's there in the X and Y axis that you normally see in the default layout. You can turn these on in the viewport overlay menu. As you can see here the grid is on, but the floor and the axes are off. You can turn it on again or off, whatever you like. On, off. Okay, so let's go back to Look Dev because we are going to make a texture and we can then better see what we are doing. And then in the properties panel, let's go to the render tab here. And as you can see, it's on Eevee render engine now. And Eevee is introduced in Blender 2.8. We also have the Cycles render engine and it's a ray trace render engine. And that means that it's more based on real life, so rays as in sun rays. It's perfect for more realistic renders, but we are making game assets here, so we will use the Eevee engine. We also have Workbench, and Workbench is similar to the Look Dev render option here in the shading options. So make sure that this is on Eevee, so here in the render tab in the properties panel, make sure it's on Eevee. And in the properties editor we now go to the material tab because we are working with materials when we are making shaders for this object. Let's have a look at the material tab. There's already a node connected to the material. You can see that because this button is blue. If there's no node connected, it's grayed out. So let's turn it on again. And let's have a look at the shader editor. We can find a Use Nodes checkbox here. And next to that we can find the name of the material. That's the same name as in the Materials tab. The Use Node checkbox is also the same as used in the Material tab. When you turn it off, it will be turned off in the Materials tab as well. By default we have 2 nodes in the shader editor. So what is this? The last one is always the material output. And the material output has an input, the surface input, and in there we put everything that will be shown on the surface of the object. In this case, your well. The shader connected to this diffuse input is the BSDF shader. That stands for bidirectional scattering distribution function, something you can forget for the time being, but it's one of the shaders used in Blender. When you press Shift A and then go to shaders, you will find all the other shaders available in Blender. We have the principal BDSF shader here, this one. We also have a diffuse shader, a glossy shader for shiny objects, a glass shader, and an emission shader for all the objects that need to emit light. But the shader we'll use most is the principled BSDF. So all the glossy parts we will fake by painting it by hand. And again, that's because we want to be cheap. So by using less textures, we'll be cheaper and will be faster. And also the finer shapes, like the roughness of stone, we'll be faking by painting it in and not using any normal map, for example. So look at the principled BSDF here and look at all the options you have here. You may recognize them and click on Shift A, so you can compare them to the options you have in the principled BSDF. So all these other shaders, like diffuse, emission, glass, glossy, you can find them back in the principled BSDF as well. So the roughness here, for example, when you put it all to the right, you have a more diffuse object, and when you put it all to the left, you have a more glossy object. And then transmission here, when you put it to 1, all to the right, here, you have a glass object. Below here, alpha, when you put it on 0, you have a transparent object, just like the transparent shader. Here we have emission, when you put the color on white, for example, the object will emit white light. You also have an input here, you can connect it to a node with a color, for example, to give light a color. Or you can also add a number, 0 is no emission, and 1, for example, is a white emitter. And below here we have a normal input. We can add a normal map to that, and that will emulate small details in an object, but we will not be using that in this course. As said, we use Paint to simulate this. And again, reason for that is because we use less processing power. Especially big normal maps can cost a lot of processing power. So why not emulate it? When done right, a good texture paint almost looks like a normal map. You will get a lot of information now about the nodes, and don't worry, if you don't get it the first time, you'll get it later on. Just repeat the process a few times and you'll get it in the end. It's not that complicated, it's just you have to get the concept of it. Now let's dive into the nodes. So the base color is the main input for colors you want to add to a model. So when you click on this white rectangle, a menu opens where you can choose a color in the color circle. And when you change the color here, you see the color of the model change accordingly. Make sure that the viewport is on the right shading mode, or else you won't see the colors. When you are on solid shading mode, you don't see any colors, it'll be just dull gray. And when you are on look depth, you'll see the color. And when you are on the rendered shading, you'll see the colors as well. Best is to put it back on look depth because it's a faster mode, depending on how fast your computer is, of course. Now we don't want this solid color, we want a texture, and that is this texture we have made here before, the small base color. We want to have that influence the base color. And the image editor is a little bit small, so by hovering over the separator here and waiting until you see the arrows, you can drag them to the left or right to make it bigger or smaller. I was going a little bit fast maybe, so to get the texture inside the image slot, you have to go to the menu here and choose the texture wall small base color we made earlier, and it will then be shown here. So again, for the base color, we don't want this solid color, but we want the texture we will make later here and then be shown on the model. So how do we do that? We have to connect something to this base color input node. So click Shift A and then choose a texture and choose an image texture. And then with return on the left mouse button, you can put it somewhere on the editor here. And then we'll click on the color output and drag it to the base color input of the principled BSDF. And when you wait a bit, the color will turn black because there's no color or no texture selected yet. But we can choose a texture, and we'll choose the texture small base color, of course. And your stays black because the texture is still black. But believe me, this texture is now showing up on your model. But how do we paint on this texture? Because when we go to this image editor, we can still click on it, not paint on it. So what we'll have to do first is, when you look here, it still says View. We have to go to Paint and then press T for the tool shelf. You'll see a brush here and some paint tools. And let's make this a little bigger again. And then press N for the second tool shelf. And as you can see here, you see all sorts of paint tools. But when painting, we better use another layout because it's getting a little bit cluttered. So let's go to the texture paint layout here. And now we have much more room for the image editor. With N, we have all our drawing options here. We also have them in the properties panel, in the tool tab. And it's only here because it's a contextual menu and it only shows up here in texture paint here in the viewport. So we have object mode and edit mode, and now we have texture paint, which we will use now. So let's close the second menu here by hitting N, zoom a bit in with the middle mouse button, like so. And now let's see if when we paint something on the model or on the texture, if it also shows up on the texture of the model. When you look on the first menu, that's under the T, or the one on the left in your viewport, you will see that it's on the brush tool at the moment. And on the right you can see in the context menu the options available for this brush. Here you have a color wheel where you can choose the colors for your brush. And here you can choose the radius for the brush. Let's put this radius on a radius of 5 pixels. And let's start painting on a texture. Let's start on this top part here. And just do it with your mouse if you want to. It doesn't have to be beautiful, we're just testing. And as you can see now, here the top part is now painted in. Just as to be expected. And then let's change a different color. Let's choose orange. So go to the color wheel and click on the color you want. Then go to the UVs that belong to the roof and paint some color in. And here again you can see the roof is painted in orange as well. Let's do this part as well, so the top one has a little bit of color as well. Not nice maybe, but you get the idea of how it works. So what's next? Well, we have painted on the texture, but we can also paint on the model itself. So let's choose a gray color and let's drag the value slider here down and make it a little bit blue. And then paint on the model. Zoom out a bit, paint a bit more, paint on this part, turn it around a bit, paint some here. Of course it's all very ugly again, but it's just to show you how it works. Okay. And as you can see, we have now painted on the model and it also appears on the texture. So let's do a recap. What have we done? We have added the material to a model, and let's go to the shading layout, and we have used a principled BSDF. We added a texture to the base color. We painted in that texture and we painted on the model. So we did quite a lot. And what we should do now is, of course, save the image. There's a star next to the word image. That means it's not saved yet. So let's do a save. Or Alt S, as you can see in the shortcut. And now the star or the asterisk here is gone, and thus the image is saved. Let's also save the project. Save. So that's it for this lecture. And let's go to the next. Bye bye.